Hi everyone, this is Ryan over here at PHP again, speaking on behalf of Bioacademics. Now last time we talked about the hip joint when we zoomed into it based on looking at a skeleton view, right? So now we've got to go real time with a human. Harder, right? Now all those landmarks we discussed, I've got to somehow palpate and try to find those so that I can get as close as possible to that axis, even though it's probably still a little bit of a guesstimation. But as specific as I can be with my palpations and how I work with my client, then I should be able to find as close as possible where these axes are that we discussed. Okay? So jumping back to what we discussed as far as what the hip is made of, we talked about the ilium and the femur being those pieces, right? So as I'm looking for axes, I'm going to first try to find that ASIS, which is what we discussed in the first video, right? So I'm just going to palpate along here and try to find where that ASIS is, which is right here, okay? Then I know from there I have to go inferior. Some people we may be able to find the AIIS, right? Some people we may not be able to, right? So I may have to jump over and palpate kind of lesser trochanter area, right? Greater trochanter area, which is right here. So I know somewhere between that point and my ASIS, I'm looking at about a 45 degrees into here, or a 90-degree angle basically where I brought my finger into, okay? And then I can physically take and just do some rotational type exercise to see where that's at. Now that feels pretty close. So let's start there as our point, okay? So knowing I've got your attention in that position, we're gonna look at this axis first, okay? So this is my sagittal plane axis. Around this axis, I can produce motion into hip abduction, abduction, and hip adduction. Okay? Sagittal plane axis, frontal plane motion. Now, if I take this, move it to the lateral side, find that greater trochanter, now I've found my frontal plane axis. My frontal plane axis can therefore produce hip flexion, right? And then hip extension back home. Okay? Frontal plane axis, sagittal plane motion. Third plane we discussed when we had the skeleton on the table prior to this session was my transverse plane. It's going to be hard to show you with this guy. If we think of the length of the femur as my line, if you will, okay? We all know that that axis is going to sit with the neck and the head of the femur more medial. It's going to sit just in line with that line of the femur. So let's just say somewhere through here, okay? Here's my ASIS, greater trochanter. Somewhere right through here is going to be the joint. There is my transverse plane axis. So around this longitudinal axis, I can therefore produce motion into hip internal rotation and hip external rotation. Okay? So transverse plane, internal and external rotation. All right? So, putting all three of these planes and joints into kind of our head, what we want to do, we've showed you on the skeleton, which is much easier to see. Now we have a human where I've got to be good at palpating and finding different positions so that I know exactly, or at least guess as close as I can to that axis. So now that I know those things, let's take this to the floor and apply forces to it so we have that real life picture as to what's going on around these joints and axes.